March 6, 1945, Cologne, Germany. In the shattered square before the great cathedral, Lieutenant Wilhelm Bartelborth presses his eye to the periscope of his Panther tank. 3 years of war spent memorizing the silhouette of every Allied tank that could kill him. The tall, boxy Sherman, the stubby little Stuart, even the up-armored Jumbo, whose thick hide still could not scratch a Panther's glacis beyond 500 yards. But the machine crawling out of the smoke and rubble now matches nothing in his manual. Low profile, sloped armor, tracks like a Sherman, but the proportions are wrong. That is not a Sherman. He mutas. He is right. 3 seconds later, his tank is a burning wreck, and he is dragged out through the hatch, deafened and burned, with no idea what. Just shattered 3 years of certainty in a single shot. This is the story of a tank so secret that the men who fought it never learned its name. A machine built to look like a Sherman, sound like a Sherman, move like a Sherman, but carrying a gun powerful enough to kill a Tiger at 1,000 yards. 20 of these tanks crossed into Germany under total secrecy in February of 1945. German intelligence never issued one warning about them. Not after the first kill, not after Cologne. This is the story of the M26 Pershing and the doctrine of invincibility that got German crews killed. If you're one of the generation that remembers these stories, we're honored you're here. What year were you born? By 1943, German tank crews had learned a brutal lesson about the war they were fighting. On the battlefields of France and Germany, they were, for the moment, untouchable gods. The Tiger I carried an 88mm gun and up to 100mm of frontal armor against the standard American Sherman. With its 75mm gun, the math was simple and it was merciless. A Sherman could not penetrate a Tiger's front armor beyond roughly 500 yards. A Tiger could kill a Sherman at 2,000 yards, more than a mile away, long before the American crew even understood what had found them. The kill ratios told a story that no propaganda needed to exaggerate. In skilled hands, a single Tiger could account for 5 Cs, 7 Shermans before it was finally destroyed. And sometimes it was never destroyed at all, only abandoned when it ran out of fuel or broke down. German veterans grimly nicknamed the Sherman the Tommy Cooker, a joke with a horrifying core of truth. The tank's gasoline engine and thin side armor meant that a single penetrating hit, even one that failed to strike anything vital, could turn the interior into an inferno within seconds. Crews had perhaps 10 seconds to escape a burning Sherman. Most did not make it. This was not just battlefield rumor. It was documented, repeated, engraved into the confidence of every Panzer crew on the Western Front. At Villers-Bocage in June of 1944, a lone Tiger commanded by Michael Whitman tore through a column of British armor in a single, furious engagement lasting less than 20 minutes. German radio propaganda would later credit him with destroying 21 armored vehicles single-handedly, a number that spread through the ranks like scripture. Independent post-war analysis suggests the true figure was smaller, something closer to a dozen tanks and armored cars destroyed by Whitman personally, with other German vehicles claiming additional kills that history simply folded into his legend. But the exaggeration almost did not matter. What mattered was what every German tanker believed walking into battle after hearing that story. One Tiger, one crew, could annihilate an entire enemy formation before breakfast. This bred more than confidence, it bred certainty, and certainty is a dangerous thing to carry into war. American tank crews knew a darker version of the same truth. They were outgunned, they were undergunned, and they knew it every time they rolled toward the front. In the hedgerows of Normandy, Sherman units ran into Tigers and Panthers on a near daily basis. And the doctrine handed down to them was blunt. Do not engage frontally, Never trade shots face to face with a German heavy tank. Instead, flank it. Find the thinner armor on the sides or the rear, or better yet, call up a tank destroyer with a 90mm gun and let someone else take the risk. In practice, this doctrine had a cruel arithmetic of its own. While one Sherman crew maneuvered desperately to find an angle on a Tiger's flank, the rest of the platoon had to hold the German tank's attention. Holding attention meant becoming a target. Becoming a target meant, more often than any commander wanted to admit, dying so that one tank might live long enough to land a killing blow from the side. Ask any American tanker who survived the hedgerows of Normandy what that waiting felt like. And the details rarely change. The engine noise swallowed by thick summer foliage, the narrow lanes bordered on both sides by earthen banks and tangled roots, corridors that funneled tanks into killing zones. The Germans had studied for weeks before a single American boot touched French soil. A gunner might catch a flash of gray steel through a gap in the hedge, gone before he could react, and spend the next several minutes with his heart hammering, waiting for the shot that might never come, or might come in the next second and end everything. Crews slept, when they slept at all, with their boots still laced, because a night attack gave no time for anything else. Many painted crude tallies inside their turrets, not of kills, but of near misses, a private ledger of how many times they had almost died that week. The smell inside a Sherman after a long day of combat, cordite and sweat and diesel and fear, became something men carried with them for the rest of their lives. Long after the war had ended and the tanks themselves had been scrapped or shipped home as museum pieces. For German crews, an encounter with Sherman silhouettes followed a script, so familiar it had become muscle memory. Spot the tall, boxy shape at long range. Engage from maximum distance, 1,500 to 2,000 yards. The first shot usually killed through penetration or through fire. If the Sherman somehow returned fire, watch the round bounce harmlessly off slope frontal armor, built to shrug off exactly that kind of hit. This pattern repeated itself hundreds of times across France, Belgium, and the borderlands of Germany. Panzer school doctrine made the lesson explicit to every graduating crew: maintain distance from the American M4. Its 75mm gun is ineffective beyond 500 yards against our frontal armor. Engage from maximum range. Do not close the distance unless necessary. Victory belongs to the patient. Patience. That single word mattered more than any statistic, because patience requires confidence, and confidence requires certainty. By the winter of 1944, German tank crews were certain they understood every threat the American army could put into the field. They were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Behind Allied lines, far from the mud and smoke of the front, American engineers had been quietly working on an answer to the Tiger for more than a year. Their creation was designated the T-26E3, soon to be renamed the M26 Pershing. It carried a 90mm M3 gun, capable of punching through German heavy armor at ranges that would have seemed like fantasy to a Sherman crew. Its armor protection was roughly double that of the Sherman it was meant to replace. At 46 tons, it was, at last, a true heavy tank, built by a nation that German doctrine insisted could never build one. But American planners faced an agonizing problem. How do you field a new heavy tank without the enemy learning it exists before it can be used to full effect? The answer was a program known as the Zebra Mission, placed under the direction of Major General Gladian M. Bonus, and built around one governing principle: total information blackout. In December of 1944, the first Pershings rolled off American production lines, but only 20 were ready. By January of the following year, a decision was made at the highest levels: rush them to Europe immediately, and do it in complete secrecy. Every Pershing crossed the Atlantic under cover of darkness, its shipping manifests deliberately falsified, the tanks themselves hidden below decks behind rows of ordinary Shermans, so that even the sailors transporting them had no idea what they were carrying. The tank crews chosen to operate this new weapon, trained in isolation at Fort Knox, sworn to secrecy under threat of court-martial. In late January, the first convoy departed American shores. The crossing took 11 days through waters, still hunted by German submarines. Upon arrival in England, the Pershings were held in secure staging areas, kept from prying eyes, even Allied ones, while commanders waited for the right window to cross the Channel into France. Here was the technical reality. The German army did not know and could not have guessed at 1,000 yards, a Pershing's 90-millimeter gun could put a killing round through a Tiger's frontal armor. At that same range, a Sherman crew could only pray, and in a detail few historians linger on. The Pershing shared the same Ford engine as the Sherman, giving it an almost identical sound signature. A small mercy of deliberate design that would let it hide in plain sight on a smoky battlefield. Its height, just over 9 feet, was close enough to a Sherman's that from a distance, through drifting smoke and shattered buildings, the silhouettes could blur into one another. That resemblance was not an accident. It was the entire point. On February 17th, 1945, after weeks of deliberate delay and deceptive routing through England and France, 20 Pershings finally reached a maintenance depot near Aachen, Germany. 10 were assigned to the 3rd Armored Division. 10 went to the 9th Armored Division. The crews received rushed familiarization training. Though most of the controls felt reassuringly familiar, close cousins to the Shermans they had been driving for years. One instruction was drilled into every crew above all others. If you are ever captured or forced to abandon your tank, destroy it completely. The enemy must not learn what this machine is. Across the lines, German intelligence heard nothing. No radio intercepts flagged it. No reconnaissance report mentioned it. No captured document. No interrogated prisoner. No rumor from the front breathed a word of it. The weapon was in position. The doctrine of invincibility still stood unchallenged and unaware of the machine, now waiting less than a day's advance away. For the American crews assigned to these 20 tanks, the days before combat carried a strange, quiet tension of their own. Many had spent the war in Shermans, had watched friends burn inside them, had learned to hate the sound a 75-millimeter shell made when it failed to penetrate, and simply glanced away into the sky. Now they sat inside a machine none of them had trained on for more than a few weeks. Heavier, stranger, still smelling of the factory rather than the battlefield. Mechanics worked through freezing nights by lantern light, tightening bolts, testing traverse motors, double-checking every system on tanks that had never been battle-tested under real fire. Some crews wondered privately whether the secrecy surrounding their new machine was less about denying the enemy information and more about protecting a program that might still fail spectacularly on its first day in combat. Rumors moved through the ranks in whispers, never an official briefing. A new heavy tank, a bigger gun. Nobody outside the assigned crews was told more than that. And even they were told only what they needed to know to keep the machine running and its existence hidden. All that remained was for someone to pull the trigger, and 8 days later, someone would. February 25th, 1945, near the Ruhr River in western Germany, morning mist clung low over frozen fields. The kind of cold that worked its way through wool coats and steel hulls alike, numbing fingers on triggers and turret controls. Somewhere in that mist, the M26 Pershing entered combat for the first time in its history, rolling forward as part of a 3rd Armored Division task force pushing east from a distance. Through drifting fog and the smoke of earlier artillery exchanges, German observers saw exactly what 3 years of training had taught them to expect: another column of American armor, another line of Sherman silhouettes crawling toward their positions. Nothing about the low winter light or the shifting haze gave any of the Pershings away. Standard doctrine that morning called for hiding the new weapon in plain sight, mixed in among ordinary Shermans so that even a careful observer would see nothing unusual in the approaching column. Veteran Panzer crews watching through their optics had seen this exact picture unfold hundreds of times before. Enemy Shermans approaching from the west. Same as always, prepare to engage at maximum range and let patience do the rest of the work. The German position opened fire first, ranging shots kicking up fountains of frozen dirt near the lead American vehicles. The column halted. Turrets began to traverse, slow and deliberate. Then one of those turrets fired, and the sound was wrong. Deeper, heavier, nothing like the flat crack of a 75mm gun. 2 rounds of 90mm armor-piercing shot struck a German strong point at roughly 1,100 yards. And when American infantry advanced past the position later that morning, there was very little left to identify. Confused radio chatter erupted across the German lines within minutes. What was that? Not a Sherman gun. Some kind of tank destroyer. Perhaps came the correction. It had a turret. It had to be a tank. But which one? Nobody could say. Inside the American column, the mood was entirely different. For the crews riding in the Pershings that morning, this was not simply another advance through frozen farmland. It was the first real test of a machine they had trained on for barely a month. A tank whose reputation existed only in briefings and rumors, never yet proven against a live German gun. Every man inside those hulls understood, in some private corner of his mind, that if the 90mm gun failed to perform as promised, they would die inside a machine even less familiar to them than the Sherman they had left behind. When the German ranging shots began falling near the column, throwing up curtains of frozen earth and shrapnel, gunners tensed over their sights, and at least one loader would later admit he found himself praying, quietly, without meaning to. As the turret began its slow traverse toward the source of the incoming fire, this was the first moment German crews sensed that something had shifted beneath their feet, that the picture of the battlefield they carried in their heads no longer matched what stood in front of them. But the realization stayed local, trapped inside one unit's radio net. The report that eventually reached division headquarters described an unknown American tank with an unusually powerful gun. Division logged it as a possible modified Sherman or perhaps a misidentified tank destroyer. No Army-wide alert followed. No warning reached the units, waiting only a few miles down the road. The very next day, the Germans caught a fragment of luck. Pershing number 38, nicknamed Fireball by its 5-man crew, was advancing through the village of Elsdorf, overwatching a roadblock while infantry cleared nearby buildings. Concealed nearby sat a Tiger belonging to a heavy Panzer battalion attached to the 9th Panzer Division. Its crew, having heard the confused, half-formed radio reports from the day before, a Sherman that was not quite a Sherman, a strange, heavier gun sound nobody could place. They did not know what it meant. But something in those fragments of chatter told them to take the unfamiliar shape seriously. The Tiger commander made his decision without much hesitation. Whatever this new contact was, do not assume it was a standard Sherman. Aim for the vulnerable points. The track, the turret ring, the gun mantlet. If nothing else presented itself, when Fireball rounded a corner into view, The Tiger fired almost immediately. Without waiting for the textbook range, without the usual patience, doctrine demanded, the round struck the gun mantlet and punched through the machine gun port beside it. Inside the turret, the impact and the spray of metal fragments killed the gunner and the loader instantly. The blow was sudden, brutal, and final for two young men who had crossed an ocean in secrecy only to die in a muddy village most of them had never heard of before that week. The commander and driver survived, dragging themselves out through the forward hatches while smoke poured from the shattered mantlet, half deaf from the blast, faces blackened, one of them badly cut by a spray of metal fragments that had missed anything vital by inches. They stumbled back toward American lines through the same rubble. Their tank had been rolling past only moments earlier, carrying with them the first-hand account any American unit had of exactly what the new Tiger threat could do to their secret weapon at close range. For the two men who did not walk away, there was no ceremony that day, only the grim, practical work of recovery crews arriving hours later to tow the smoking hull back for repair. The bodies of their crewmates carried out in silence. This should have been the moment German intelligence finally understood what it was facing. A Tiger crew had engaged an unfamiliar American vehicle at close range, penetrated its armor, and could describe exactly what they had seen, advise all units immediately. Instead, the after-action report was stamped for local distribution only, filed at Corps headquarters, and left there. No Army-wide bulletin followed. No warning reached the men who had faced the same tank or its sister vehicles. In the days ahead, one encounter, however violent, was not judged sufficient evidence to revise doctrine for an entire army fighting a collapsing war on two fronts. Fireball itself, remarkably, survived. Engineers worked through the following days to repair the damaged turret and mantlet, and within roughly 10 days the tank was back in fighting condition. One of the more striking testaments to how much punishment the new design could absorb and still function, before that repair was complete, there was another battle still to come. And this one would prove far more costly for the German side than anyone briefing that morning could have imagined. February 27, 1945, American forces had captured Elsdorf the day before, and German command ordered an immediate counterattack to retake the village. 4 Tiger tanks and 2 Panzer IVs formed the spearhead, an overwhelming concentration of armor by any standard of the war up to that point. The German commander leading the assault carried an intelligence briefing that described the American forces holding Elsdorf as standard Sherman units. 4 Tigers against a handful of Shermans was not, by any reasonable calculation, a fair fight. He was entirely right about that. He simply had the wrong side marked as the certain loser. Task Force Lovelady had positioned itself southeast of the village, occupying nearly perfect intercept ground. Among its vehicles sat Pershing No. 40, commanded by Sergeant Nick Mashlonik, a combat veteran who had fought his way across France and into Germany since the earliest days after Normandy. He had commanded the Pershing for barely 5 days. The German armor advanced with the same doctrinal confidence that had carried Panzer crews through years of victories, Tigers leading, gunners scanning for targets at the range where their guns owned the battlefield. They spotted American armor at roughly 1,000 yards, the exact distance where Sherman crews had always been essentially defenseless, where a Tiger gunner could take his time, confirm the target, and fire at his leisure. The lead Tiger crew studied the low shape sitting motionless in the distance and judged it to be a stationary Sherman, not yet worth the ammunition. Better to wait, focus on nearby infantry positions first, and deal with the tank once it closed to a range where the kill was guaranteed. Inside Pershing No. 40, the barrel eased upward slightly, adjusting for range. Mashlonik's gunner had the Tiger fixed in his sight and was already asking permission to fire The order that came back from the German side of that silent standoff, reconstructed from survivor accounts after the war, was to wait to let the target close to 500 meters before committing a round. That was doctrine, that was patience. That was, in this one instance, fatale miscalculation. The first 90-millimeter round left Pershing No. 40's barrel and punched straight through the Tiger's frontal armor, while the American tank was still moving. At a range the German manual insisted was safe. Inside the Tiger, the impact brought chaos that none of the surviving doctrine had prepared anyone for. A second round followed roughly 20 seconds later, a third, then a fourth feu rapide, high-velocity, armor-piercing rounds fired in well under a minute. The Tiger crew never managed to return fire. When American infantry reached the smoking wreck afterward, there were no survivors to interrogate about what had gone wrong. Mashlonik was not finished testing the limits of his new gun that long. Brutal, unforgiving week of fighting near Elsdorf. In the days that followed, as the advance pushed on toward Cologne, his crew added more kills to their tally, including a Panzer IV caught in the open. By the campaign's end, Pershing No. 40 was credited with 4 confirmed kills, making it the highest-scoring vehicle of its type in the entire war, a record that would stand unmatched by any other Pershing crew for the rest of the remaining months of fighting in Europe. Inside Mashlonik's Pershing, the mood after the last round left the barrel was not celebration, so much as grim, focused momentum, the same wary stillness that settles over any crew who understands the fight is almost certainly not over yet. Men who had spent years watching Shermans die to exactly this kind of ambush now found themselves on the other side of that equation. And the shift did not feel entirely real yet. The gunner later described his hands as steady through the whole engagement. An ode, almost clinical calm settling over him as round after round found its mark. The kind of calm that soldiers sometimes only recognize as unusual once the adrenaline finally drains away hours afterward. The loader worked without pause, feeding fresh rounds into the breech with the practiced rhythm of a man who understood that any hesitation on his part could undo everything the gun had just accomplished. Smoke from the burning Tiger drifted low across the field, mixing with the cordite stink inside the American turret, and for a long moment afterward, nobody spoke at all. Roughly 2 miles away, another German panzer unit heard the entire engagement unfold over the radio. Heavy gunfire, explosion, confused chatter about impossible penetrations at ranges that should have guaranteed safety. They requested an intelligence update from division, hoping for some explanation of what exactly their comrades had run into. The response that came back offered nothing new. No new enemy armor reported. Assumed standard Sherman engagements. Maintained current doctrine. Some of those very crews would meet Pershings themselves within days. And they would go into those encounters just as unprepared, just as confident as every unit that had come before them. In any modern army, information is supposed to flow upward and outward in a predictable chain. A frontline encounter produces a unit report. The unit report reaches division intelligence, division intelligence. If the threat seems significant enough, generates an army-wide bulletin. That bulletin reshapes tactical doctrine for every crew still facing the enemy. 6 days was, by most standards of the period, a generous window for that entire chain to complete itself. For the Pershing, it never happened at all. Trace the reports individually, and the failure becomes almost mechanical in its simplicity. The Ruhr River encounter on February 25th produced a report describing an unknown American tank with an unusually powerful gun, distributed only within the receiving division. Dismissed as possibly a modified Sherman due to insufficient detail, the Fireball ambush the next day produced a report confirming a new heavy tank, penetrated successfully by an 88mm round, distributed only as far as Corps headquarters, held back from wider release because a single encounter was not considered sufficient to justify an Army-wide alert. The Elsdorf counterattack on February 27th produced a third report describing an enemy tank capable of destroying a Tiger frontally at 1,000 yards, distributed within the division, with the recommended course of action being further investigation into whether the vehicle might be a captured Panther or a new class of tank destroyer, rather than anything requiring immediate warning to other units. 3 separate encounters, 3 separate reports, 3 separate intelligence channels that never once connected with each other, despite describing the same weapon operating within roughly 20 miles of open front. This is the part of the story that deserves real scrutiny, because the failure here was not laziness, and it was not cowardice, and it was not even, in any simple sense, incompetence. It was something closer to institutional blindness. Senior German assessments of the period rested on a belief that had hardened into near religious certainty. The Americans had never fielded a true heavy tank. American industrial doctrine favored overwhelming numbers of adequate machines over small numbers of superior ones. And the Sherman itself was proof of that philosophy. Reports describing a heavier, more capable American tank were, by this logic, most likely exaggerations born of combat stress, or crews misidentifying captured German vehicles, or confusion with American tank destroyers that carried similar caliber guns but no rotating turret. There is a particular kind of failure that only happens inside organizations that have been right for a very long time. A young officer reading an unfamiliar report might have raised it up the chain out of pure caution, unwilling to bet his career on an assumption he could not personally verify. A veteran officer, one who had spent 3 years watching Sherman after Sherman burn on schedule, at the ranges doctrine predicted, in the manner doctrine predicted, had far less incentive to treat a strange new report as anything more than noise. His experience, the very thing that made him valuable, was precisely what made him slow to see the exception forming in front of him. Every previous report of an unusually tough American vehicle over the preceding years had eventually resolved into something mundane: a misidentified tank destroyer, a captured German vehicle pressed into American service, an exaggeration born of a frightened crew's memory playing tricks under fire. Why would this set of reports be any different? Physical evidence of the Pershing's existence was not actually scarce by early March. 20 of these tanks were operating openly across roughly 50 kilometers of front, engaging German forces in plain daylight, leaving behind wrecked Tigers and Panthers that any competent intelligence officer could have examined. But the institutional conviction that America would not build a heavy tank proved stronger than the mounting evidence arriving from the front lines of the Army's own soldiers. This is what happens when confirmation bias meets a fracturing command structure. Each report got measured against the prevailing assumption rather than against the last 2 reports that had said almost exactly the same thing. There was also, by early March of 1945, a simpler and grimmer explanation running alongside the institutional one. The German army was fighting a collapsing war on 2 fronts simultaneously. Soviet forces were driving hard from the east. Command structures were fragmenting under the sheer weight of retreat after retreat. And resources that might once have gone toward chasing down a curious battlefield report were being spent instead on basic survival. A new American tank, however dangerous, simply did not rank as a priority against the scale of the disaster unfolding across the rest of the country. Ironically, a timely warning about the Pershing might have saved lives on both sides of the front in the very days that followed. But survival, not curiosity, governed every decision being made at every level of a crumbling command. By the first days of March, the Pershing had been in combat for roughly a week, It had killed Tigers. It had killed Panthers. It had been hit once, seriously damaged, repaired, and returned to the fight. And German intelligence across an entire army group still had no formal record acknowledging that the tank existed at all. Somewhere in a filing cabinet at Corps headquarters sat 3 separate reports, each one a fragment of the same picture, each one waiting for an officer with the time, the authority, and the willingness to set them side by side and ask the obvious question. Nobody ever did. The war did not pause to let anyone catch up on paperwork, and the men on the front lines paid the price for that delay in a currency far more permanent than administrative inconvenience. Meanwhile, the advance continued. Task forces from the 3rd Armored Division pushed steadily toward Cologne through the first days of March, grinding past shattered villages and hastily abandoned German positions. The city's cathedral spires visible on the horizon days before any American soldier set foot inside the city itself. Word of strain, unusually resilient Sherman lookalikes had by now spread in whispers among some German units nearby. Second-hand accounts passed soldier to soldier rather than officer to officer. The kind of rumor that never survives contact with an official chain of command already convinced it knows the shape of the battlefield. The city itself offered little comfort to either side. By this point in the war, Cologne had endured well over 200 Allied air raids since 1942. Its rail yards and factories reduced to blackened skeletons, its famous cathedral standing improbably intact amid streets of collapsed masonry and burned-out buildings. Most of the population had already fled or been evacuated, leaving behind a city that felt, to the soldiers advancing through it, less like a place people had once lived and more like the ruins of some ancient civilization, silent except for the crunch of rubble underfoot and the distant thud of artillery. Somewhere in that rubble, a Panther crew belonging to Panzer Brigade 106 was settling into ambush positions near the train station, preparing for the same fight they had fought and won 100 times before. Entirely unaware that the machine waiting to enter their city carried a gun capable of ending a lifetime of hard-won combat experience in a matter of seconds. Their commander, Lieutenant Wilhelm Bartelborth, had been fighting since 1943. He had killed Shermans in France. He had killed Shermans in Belgium. He had killed Shermans on German soil in the very approaches to this city, and he carried that record the way any veteran carries proof of his own competence. As something close to certainty, urban combat suited men like him. Narrow streets limited enemies' ability to maneuver or spot an ambush before it was too late. All that was required was patience, concealment, and the willingness to let the enemy come close enough that the first shot would also be the last one needed. It was, by every measure his experience could offer him, a plan that had never once failed. He briefed his gunner and loader that evening with the same quiet confidence he had carried into a dozen earlier engagements, certain that whatever the Americans sent down that street the next morning, it would look, sound, and die exactly like every Sherman that had come before it, just as it had every single time before, without exception, for 3 long, hard-fought, bloody, thoroughly exhausting years of war. March 6, 1945, late morning, elements of the 3rd Armored Division pushed into the heart of Cologne, moving street by shattered street toward the cathedral, whose twin spires still rose, improbably intact, above the ruins around them. Ahead, hidden near the train station at 90 degrees to the main avenue, Lieutenant Wilhelm Bartelborth waited inside his Panther, exactly where hard-won experience told him to wait, in a position offering a clean shot down a narrow intersection that any approaching column would have to cross. For nearly 2 hours, American infantry cleared buildings along the route, slow and deliberate work, room by room. While the tanks held back to provide covering fire only when needed, then 2 Sherman tanks rolled forward into the intersection. The lead vehicle slowed to navigate a pile of rubble blocking its path, and its crew radioed for a dozer to clear the way, unaware they had just entered a killing zone. Bartleborth had studied for hours. He gave the order to fire. The first round struck the lead Sherman's gun mantlet and punched through into the turret. A second round followed almost immediately, and inside that tank, the driver and bow gunner never made it out. A third shot disabled the second Sherman's tracks, but its crew escaped, running and scrambling through the rubble toward whatever cover they could find. In the chaos of that same exchange, a civilian sedan appeared in the intersection, caught directly in the crossfire between the German and American positions. Inside it were a local merchant and his employee, a young woman named Katharina Esser, both trying desperately to reach the safety of the bridge across the Rhine. Esser was struck and killed, despite the efforts of American medics who reached the car within minutes. One more life lost in a battle that, for here, had nothing to do with tanks or doctrine at all. An urgent radio call went out from the surviving Sherman crew, Panther in ambush, northeast corner of the intersection, requesting immediate armor support, something heavy enough to match the German guns' range 2 blocks away. Pershing number Eagle 7 had been working a parallel street, its commander, Sergeant Bob Early, receiving the call and making his decision within seconds. Nearby, Technical Sergeant Jim Bates of the Army's 65th Photo Signal Company, who had been filming combat footage across the city that morning, approached the tank and asked what was happening. Early told him simply that if they were going in, Bates had better have his camera ready. Bates followed inside the Pershing, Gunner Corporal Clarence Smoyer, just 21 years old, waited at his station alongside loader John DeRiggi, driver Woody McVeigh, and radio operator Homer Davis. Early's plan was straightforward, approach from a side street rather than straight down the avenue. The Panther was watching, using the German tank's own fixed field of fire against it. The Pershing eased forward, engine note steady, tracks grinding over broken stone. Inside the Panther, the gunner spotted movement first, a low shape emerging from an angle. Nobody in that crew had been watching closely. Bartleborth swung his periscope toward it and found himself looking at something his memory could not immediately place. Wrong silhouette, wrong turret shape, not the tall, boxy profile burned into 3 years of recognition training. For several seconds that would prove to be the most consequential of his life. He hesitated, unwilling to commit to a target he could not confidently identify. Was it one of their own, repositioned from another sector? Was it some captured vehicle pressed into German service? He ordered his crew to hold fire until he could be certain. That hesitation was the entire war in miniature. A veteran's hard-won confidence meeting one machine it had never been trained to recognize, and finding itself, for the first and only time that mattered, unable to decide fast enough. Smoyer had the Panther fixed in his sight well before Bartleborth resolved his doubt. 200 yards. Stationary, Early gave the order to fire. The 90mm gun spoke a deeper, heavier report than anything a Sherman 75mm could produce. One that echoed off the broken facades lining the square and rolled out across the rubble toward the cathedral itself. The round struck just below the Panther's gun mantlet and penetrated cleanly. Smoke poured from the impact point as the crew inside scrambled for the hatches. Bartleborth among them, badly shaken, but alive. 3 of his crew following him out into the street, coughing, disoriented, one of them clutching a wound he would carry for the rest of his life. A second round followed within seconds. Then a third, the Panther catching fire as the rounds tore through armor that had shrugged off Allied guns for years, without ever meeting, one built specifically to defeat it. From first shot to last, the entire exchange lasted only a matter of seconds. The kind of span that soldiers on both sides would later describe as feeling simultaneously instantaneous and endless. Adrenaline, stretching a handful of heartbeats into something that felt, in memory, like minutes. For the crew inside Eagle 7, there was little time to process what had just happened before training took over again. Smoyer stayed at his site, scanning for any sign of a second threat while Dirigi reloaded automatically, and Early kept his eyes moving across the square, watching for German infantry who might still be sheltering in the surrounding buildings with anti-tank weapons of their own. Only after several long minutes of silence, with no further fire coming from anywhere near the smoking Panther, did the tension inside the turret finally begin to ease. Jim Bates captured nearly all of it on film. The smoking Panther, the Pershing advancing cautiously past it, a German crewman stumbling from the wreckage with his uniform still burning before collapsing in the street. American soldiers moved in with weapons raised, uncertain whether more resistance waited nearby. Bates ran up to Early's tank afterward, breathless, telling him he thought he had gotten the whole thing on film. He had that footage, developed and distributed in the weeks that followed, would become one of the most widely viewed pieces of combat film to survive the entire war. And decades later, a single frame from it, the young crew of Eagle 7 standing in their hatches with the cathedral rising behind them, would appear on the cover of a book telling their story to a new generation. By evening, confused radio traffic spread through the remaining German defenders of Cologne. Panther number 424 destroyed near the cathedral. What kind of enemy vehicle? Unknown, came the reply. Survivors say it looked something like a Sherman, but was not one. The gun sounded different, heavier. A request went out for clarification. Whether the vehicle was American or possibly a captured German machine misidentified in the confusion of battle, no clear answer ever came back that night. Cologne fell the following morning, March 7th, and the remaining German units withdrew across the Rhine, carrying with them a report describing an unfamiliar American tank that would, like the reports from Ruhr River and Elsdorf before it, never travel further than the file drawer of a headquarters already collapsing under the weight of a two-front war. That same day, 40 miles to the south, at Remagen, Pershings from the 9th Armored Division were doing what their sister tanks had done all week, quietly rewriting the rules of the battlefield without German intelligence ever catching up. A platoon of 4 operational Pershings under Lieutenant John Grimball supported the infantry assault that seized the Ludendorff Bridge across the Rhine, intact, their 90mm guns immobilizing a German train some 800 yards away and helping hold the crossing open long enough for the rest of the army to pour across behind them. Not one German report from that action mentioned the presence of a new heavy American tank either. To the defenders at Remagen, just as at Cologne, just as at Elsdorf, the battle was still, on paper, being fought against Germans. The Wehrmacht never issued a single army-wide bulletin about the M26 Pershing for the remainder of the war, not after Ruhr River, not after Fireball, not after Elsdorf, not after Cologne. The tank fought on through the final weeks of fighting in Germany. Its total combat record, modest in raw numbers, roughly 20 confirmed German tanks destroyed by a total of perhaps 20 vehicles that ever saw action. But its deeper impact was never really about numbers. It was about what happened inside a Panther crew's turret in the 3 seconds it took a veteran commander to realize he no longer recognized the battlefield in front of him. Clarence Smoyer went home after the war and lived a long, quiet life, rarely speaking about Cologne except among close family. He lived to be 99 years old, In 2019, 74 years after that afternoon in the Cathedral Square, the United States Army finally awarded him the Bronze Star for his actions that day. A recognition delayed by decades of paperwork and bureaucratic oversight, not entirely unlike the kind that had once kept an entire army blind to the tank he had fired that day. When asked, late in life, what he thought about the German crew he had killed, he said simply that he wished someone had warned them. It would not have changed what he had to do, but every soldier, he believed, deserved to know exactly what he was facing before. The moment that decided whether he lived or died, the cathedral still stands in Cologne today, rebuilt and restored around its unbroken spires. The Panther that fell in its shadow was scrapped long ago. The lesson underneath the whole story has outlived both of them. An army that had dominated tank warfare for years fell, in the end, not to a stronger enemy alone, but to its own certainty that it already understood every threat it could possibly face. In va, as in anything else, the most dangerous gap is rarely the one in your armor. It is the one in your intelligence, the space between what you know and what you assume. And for the crews who died never learning the name of the tank that killed them, that gap proved to be the only one that mattered.